Hey folks, welcome to lecture number 2. This is our first content lecture where we're going to be talking about the Butler essay you read, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory. So that title is obviously a mouthful, and it is absolutely the case that in Butler's writing, some things are a little bit complicated, which is why the writing or the article that you read is highlighted down into sections that are meant to make it more digestible. She is sort of a notoriously difficult writer. Some people are more critical of her writing than to call it difficult, but she is also one of the most esteemed intellectuals working today, especially in the fields of gender studies and queer theory. Her idea of gender as performance is probably one of the more influential concepts in feminism. So it's a really important one for us to understand, especially as it relates to performance. So that's going to be our main discussion of Butler today. To start off, though, I'm actually going to ask you to do a writing exercise first. So I want you to do this before we get into our discussion today, and then I'm going to ask you to revisit your writing exercise at the end of the next lecture and do something with it then. So to start off, though, you are watching this lecture probably at around 3 or 4 p.m. So you've gone through a whole afternoon today, or maybe it's the next day and you're watching it in the mornings and all you've done is woken up and brushed your teeth, whatever. But in any case, there has been a period of time since when you first woke up this morning and when you sat down to watch this lecture. I want you to think about what during that period of time you did to perform your gender, that you would think about as being a performance of your gender. So in this way, you could think about getting dressed. You could think about if you applied makeup or did not apply makeup. You could think about how you spoke, how you acted to others, what your interactions with others were like. You could think about anything that happened to you. And I just want you to make a list of things that you think happened to you this morning that were performances of your gender, or even that were in some ways influenced by what you identify as being your gender. And so take a moment then, and pause me, and make this list. So I want you to think about, so you're going to list out first then all of the things that you did this morning that you think relate to your gender, that you think are a performance of your gender, and that is your gender identity, whatever you define your own gender as being. And then I want you, after you have made this list of things that you've done, to take a second and see if you can think about where you learned those behaviors. So that could be the media, it could be that your parents taught you, it could be that your friends or through socialization you feel like you acquired this behavior, it could be that you have no idea. But so that's the nature of the writing assignment. So pause me for a second and do those two things. The first thing being make a list of all of the things that you did this morning that you feel like were performances of or relate to your gender or your gender identity. And then write down where you feel like you learned those performances, where you feel like you learned those things that you did, that you feel like play out or enact your gender. So take a minute and just do that. And no judgments. I'm not going to ask. I mean, you send me some of these things for attendance sometimes, but I'm not going to ask to read these. So do not feel in any way that you are under surveillance when you're writing down how you felt this morning. Just take a moment and just reflect on that. And then we're going to pick back up to talk about Butler. Okay, so I just want you to sit with that exercise for a little bit, and when we conclude our discussion today, I'm going to ask you to return to it and see if you think about or might evaluate your feelings differently, or what happened to you differently, or your gender performances differently, having discussed Butler and Bornstein's analyses of gender and gender performance. So to start off then, As I said already, Judith Butler is sort of a notoriously difficult writer, and this essay in particular is contextualized as an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory. So it is very philosophically concerned. Phenomenology is a school of philosophical thought. For our perspective, we're only going to talk about these philosophical concepts to the extent that they matter for Butler's larger points about gender and performance. So the only thing that we really need to understand, for instance, about phenomenology is the way that it understands the individual's relationship to the world, the way that it understands the individual's relationship in the world. And this is what she talks about in the opening paragraph of the essay. So she says that in phenomenology, and we've been talking about this distinction all semester, there's a distinction that's made between the subject, that's you, and then the object, which is something in the world. And phenomenology says that the individual's perception, so their senses, and also their cognitive functions, so the way that you think, your concepts for understanding the world, that those things actively construct the world. So the individual, from phenomenology's perspective, makes their own reality. They make their own reality. So there are a lot of questions you might ask about that, and you would ask probably pretty good questions. Phenomenology is not the most, it hasn't aged the best out of all philosophical theories, but one thing that phenomenology does think about or try to prove is that there are sort of unique structures to how humans perceive the world or perceive phenomena, and that we can discover those structures, so we can discover what is true about the world through discovering what is true about sort of all human perception. But for our purposes, that level of detail is not necessary. All we really need to understand Butler's point, is that phenomenology thinks that as a subject, you determine the world, that you have authority over, in other words, what is perceived, that you can have real knowledge of the world that is actually descriptive, that is real knowledge of the world. Butler is going to say that it is in fact the opposite. That is to say that social reality and cultural reality and the world around us determines us as subjects. It determines what we perceive, how we perceive it, the value we assign to the world. And this is oftentimes what is called a position of social constructivism. Her version of social constructivism is really influenced by post-structuralist and postmodernist theories, especially ones about language, but I really don't think we super have to get into the nitty-gritty of that to understand her main argument as being that while we typically conceive of individuals as having an adequate perception of reality, it is in fact that how we perceive the world and how we view the world and how we act in the world is determined by the reality in which we as people grow up in and live our lives in, that we become in. So the idea here then is just to say then that as opposed to saying that the world is a given and that there is a real and fixed relationship between us and the world, that how we perceive the world is socially produced. And for Butler, it is particularly produced through how we use language, So in this essay, then, she wants to apply this discussion to gender. She talks about gender as being what she calls a stylized repetition of acts, or the stylization of the body. And her argument is going to be that we conceive of gender as being something natural, something that exists in the world, or we often do. And I think that people do less now than when Butler was originally writing this essay, partly because Butler has helped popularize this point of view. But in any case, the idea is that gender is the stylized repetition of acts, and how we understand how to enact gender comes from how we are socialized. It doesn't come from something in the world, it doesn't come from something innate in us. It comes from the social construction of reality. It comes from the social processes, the cultural processes, and the systems of power that tell us how to perform and enact our genders, that tell us what it means to be a man or a woman, or to even be non-binary or between genders, that our perception of what a gender is and our perception of the relationship between sex and gender are things that are socially constructed or socially determined, socially constructed or socially determined. That's her argument. And she's going to say that it is something that is determined through the performance of social scripts. So we'll get to that discussion in just a second. But that's where we're going. So Butler then says that gender is what she calls a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo. In other words, how we perform gender, the fact that gender appears to be something concrete in the world, is put in place by social processes, like we've said, and then taboos being restrictions or consequences from acting outside of the scripts that tell us how to act. So her perspective then is to say, first, that how we understand gender and sex and the relationship between the two is socially determined. That social determination is enforced by social structures and also social taboos. So it has something to do with power. And power is what fixes how we see gender every day and how we see gender materialized in everyday performances. And this is why she calls gender a performative accomplishment. At the same time, though, so the second important point that she makes in the introduction is that just because gender is a performative accomplishment, that doesn't mean there's no escaping it. That is just because our scripts for how to perform gender are taking from power, that doesn't mean they always have to re-entrench power. That in fact, because gender is something that is performed, that means there isn't a necessary link between your biology and your gender. And that means there isn't a necessary link between your gender and how you choose to perform it, or your gender identity and how you perform it. That all of these things are, as we've said, performances. So they are acts that we use to perform our gender. They're not things natural to our sex. And so that means then that they can be changed. That what we find restrictive about gender performance can be, over time, challenged and changed. So, I mean, in a very superficial example, you can think about the way, for instance, that how women are socially permitted to dress and what is considered feminine society has dramatically changed over time. It is not as if in the time between the 1950s and now, or the 1920s and now, the biological sex that we identify with women has changed, like biologically. Nothing about women's biology has changed, as far as I know, at least in the last 50 years, or in the last 80 years, or in the last 100 years. But how we expect gender to be expressed certainly has. So this is an idea then that through performing things different ways, for instance, for performing femininity by wearing jeans instead of by wearing dresses, we are capable of rewriting some of these associations or some of these performances. And in the struggle for women to be able to wear, for instance, pantsuits, part of that was conceived as a struggle over power, that women were always kept subordinate in the workplace because they were put in delicate dresses as opposed to being able to present themselves in the same way as men did. So these things then are always connected back to power, and even the most superficial performances of gender change a lot over time, and we can think about those things as being subject to political contestation because they're not linked, because again, sex doesn't determine exactly how we play out our genders, that culture and politics and socialization have a lot to do with that. So that means means then that through social and political contestation, through performing gender otherwise, it is possible to challenge existing gender scripts, or at least put them to different uses. And we're going to talk about some examples. So Butler's example for this is drag, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as we get to the conclusion of her article. So that is, though, the basic rundown of what this whole discussion is about. So the first main section starts off with this discussion that we've been having so far in more concrete terms of the difference between sex and gender. So she talks about Simone de Beauvoir, who's an early feminist thinker, and her discussion of how gender is a historical situation and not an objective fact. That gender is a historical situation, not an objective fact. That what puts together gender is a number of performances that are repeated over time, So I don't want you to worry about the nitty-gritty. I've pulled out a lot of language here in the outline, and it would be totally fine with me if you asked any questions about this. But the main thing that I think is important from her discussion of de Beauvoir is that de Beauvoir thinks about gender as being social constructed, but it thinks about sex as being natural, sex as being biology, and gender as being social. And that is how many people still talk about the relationship between sex and gender today. What Butler is going to say is that that is absolutely not the case, that the matter of sex, that the fact that you are a biological material that has an X or a Y, or is missing or possesses a Y chromosome, whatever your biological composition is as a person, that it is through the ways in which you have been enculturated to enact that biology that sex is actually constructed, that sex is a function of gender. It's not the other way around. So this is one of Butler's fundamental arguments, and a lot of feminists make this argument as well, that we are compelled to mark, to materialize, to announce our sexes through the performance of biological gender, or rather through the performance of gender. That it is then because we, for instance, have an imperative in our society that says that there should be, that heterosexual couples should reproduce, that individuals mark themselves as being of different binary genders in order to signal to each other their heterosexual availability. And that when one confuses these terms, it can lead to a lot of social sanction because of that societal structure that is organized around heterosexual familial relationships and heterosexual coupling. So the idea here then is that inside of societies, it is the concepts of gender, how gender is socially constructed, that determine how we think about our biological characteristics as mapping onto what we call sex. So her argument is that sex is just as socially constructed as gender. And this is a position that has gotten a lot more popular as people have lobbied for transgender rights, as the LGBTQ community has expanded to the LGBTQ plus community and have started to think about things like pansexuality and people who are non-binary, meaning they don't identify as either men or women. That these sorts of gender identifications tell us that sex is not determined by a biology, that sex is not a biologically determining factor that dictates how we enact gender, that sexuality and gender, that these things are a spectrum, is Butler's argument, and is the argument of a lot of feminists now, is that many people are somewhere on the continuum between what we identify as being masculine and feminine, that many people are on the continuum between what we identify as being heterosexual and gay, that many people do not fall within these binary characteristics. And so these binary characteristics then become very oppressive for a lot of people in society. And the suggestion then that Butler is making isn't that we should destroy gender as a category necessarily, but that we have to realize that gender is something that is performed, that it's not natural, and that what stabilizes gender as something that is binary is what is largely an oppressive, patriarchal, and heteronormative system. And so, patriarchy, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, is a system in which men are dominant over women, and heteronormativity is a system in which a heterosexual relationship is taken to be the natural or the default way of being sexually attracted to people. We might also think about how a lot of societies, or how thinking about sexuality as a binary, as we've said, is trans exclusionary, or excludes people who do not identify as being one of those two poles, But Butler's argument is exactly that. Society is organized around what she calls the heterosexual contract. And here she talks about this in terms of kinship systems. So the argument is that societies made non-heterosexual relationships taboo precisely because they needed to, as we've said, socially reproduce, that there was an imperative to expand the population, and that imperative created a demand for the heterosexual family system. And the idea then is that this system is how sex and gender became naturalized as binary opposites and as intrinsically related, when in fact, in many cultures, they haven't been. So in many indigenous populations, multiple genders are recognized, for instance. And in many indigenous populations, people allow individuals to choose between which gender identification they experience. And this is something that Bornstein will talk about. And increasingly, people in Western communities embrace that idea too. But the idea is that the lineage, what is handed down our gender scripts, is this heterosexual contract, and that in many cases we still experience this taboo that prohibits non-heterosexual and non-binary sexual identifications or gender performances, and at the same time promotes heterosexual relationships as being the norm or the standard, and that the scripts surrounding gender then exist because of this. So this is one of the places where I think we get the best definition of performativity, the idea of gender performance, in this article. So she says, quote, "The act that one does, the act that one performs, is, in a sense, an act that has been going on before one arrived on the scene. Hence, gender is an act which has been rehearsed, much as a script survives the particular actors who make use of it, but which requires individual actors in order to be actualized and reproduced as reality once again." So the performance of gender, then, what she's saying here is that we have what she is calling gendered scripts. They're scripts that have been passed down through socialization, through cultural systems, that tell us how to enact our gender, that tell us that we ought to enact our gender, and many times in relationship to the biological sex we were assigned at birth. And that those scripts are rehearsed through, not because, well, we perform them again and again every day ourselves, but they've also been performed by our parents and their parents before them, that they've been rehearsed long before we came onto the scene. So she refers to us then as actors who are stepping into these roles, which is how we connect this to performance studies then, is that we think about performance as something that has, again, two possibilities. And this is where we're getting to our conclusion, and also where we started. That is, the performance of gender can, on the one hand, materialize social laws or render social laws explicit. That is, we can perform the gender scripts that have been handed down to us as they are. And what she's saying is, when she says that a script needs a performer to actualize it, it's that when nobody is interacting with a gender script, or just like when nobody is interacting with a Shakespeare script, nobody is affected by it, that it doesn't actually exist, that gender roles are only materialized when they are enacted or performed. script. So we perform gender roles every day and repeat them, and have repeated them through generations. But as she says then, it is possible for us to perform gender otherwise precisely because the scripts are things that have to be enacted again and again and again, that they aren't fixed, that they require us as performers to re-engage with them. So again then, she says that performance renders social laws explicit on the one hand, but there's a space for exception because every social script enters into a relationship with the body who is doing the performance. That is, as performers, there is this moment of contingency, what Pollock would call, so contingency is many things could happen. It is uncertain what could happen. What Pollock might call a collision, and that in that way, in that collision, there's a chance for something new. There's the chance to perform otherwise. So her argument to conclude then is that drag gives us an example of performing otherwise. So again, drag is, or for those of you who don't know rather, I say again, that is one of my vocal disfluencies that I picked up recently. But for those of you who might not be familiar with drag, drag is when men or women, typically who actually identify as their own gender identities. Being a person who does drag is not the same as being trans, typically. So when somebody performs in drag then, they are signifying as one gender, even though they don't technically biologically identify with it. So the idea here then is that what drag does, so you could think about RuPaul's Drag Race as an example of this, is it reveals gender performance as something that is stylized. It reveals that the biological sex of a person does not matter to their gender presentation. So I think drag is a really interesting example, and it's one that Butler talks about a lot. And the idea here isn't that simply dressing in the clothes of another person is subversive or in some ways rebels against gender norms. The idea is instead that individuals who engage in the performance of gender as a way of, as a mode of expression, as a mode of performance that doesn't have anything to do with how they just think about their biological sexes, but has something to do with how they want to enact these identities, this notion of performance, that what it reveals is that gender is a construct. So she concludes then, and I'm going to conclude here in our lecture on Butler by reading this paragraph. We're going to then move into our next lecture where we talk about Bornstein, and we're going to hit on a lot of similar themes. And just to remind you then, we're going to conclude your writing exercise at the end of the next lecture. So to conclude our discussion of Butler then, she says though, genders, quote, then can be neither true nor false, neither real nor apparent, and yet one is compelled to live in a world in which genders constitute univocal, which is they mean one thing, signifiers, communicators. That is, in which genders mean one thing, in which gender is stabilized, polarized, rendered discrete, and intractable. In effect, gender is made to comply with a model of truth and falsity, which not only contradicts its own performative fluidity, that is, the fluidity of gender performance, but serves a social policy of gender regulation and control. Performing one's gender wrong initiates a set of punishments, both obvious and indirect, and performing one's gender well provides the reassurance that there is an essentialism of gender identity after all. That is, that there is something really true about biological gender, or biologically true or naturally true about gender identity. So that is her ultimate summary then, is that this relationship that we're discussing, the relationship of having these binary gender scripts that say people are men or women, people are heterosexual by default, act like it, that those are fundamentally things that get in the way of the real fluidity of gender and the real fluidity of sexual identification and of sexual orientation, and that they exist as such because they support definite systems of power, So the idea then is that at the end of the day, many of the ways we perform gender are oppressive or repressive, and that performing gender wrong is subject to taboo and censorship. But at the same time, she's arguing this is something that we can use performance to interrogate or to fight against or to resist, because performance always has the possibility built into it that we might be able to perform these roles otherwise. So as we're transitioning to the next video, I just want you to think a little bit. So remember, Butler is writing this. I think that this essay is published in the 90s. I don't know if it has a date on it, but Gender Trouble came out in 1989, which is her first major book. So it has been 30 years since much of this theory was popularized, and it has been even longer since feminism came onto the scene. So I want you to think, have things changed since Butler is writing this? Do you feel like the same imperatives exist in our society? Do you think that maybe it depends on what subculture one occupies? So think about these things, because I don't think that everything that I said is not necessarily set in stone. And what Butler does want us to think about is we can perform otherwise. So one of the questions is, have we performed otherwise since the time of her writing? So reflect on that, and then we'll talk about Bornstein in just a moment.